In the year 1242, Europe was staring into a chasm of fear. An unstoppable force had swept out of the east, a whirlwind of horsemen that shattered everything in its path. The Mongol Horde. Russia was a field of smoldering ruins. The grand cities of Kiev and Vladimir sacked. At the Battle of Liegnitz, the combined might of Polish and German knights was simply erased. Just 2 days later, the cream of Hungarian nobility was annihilated at the Battle of Moshi. Mongol armies, led by General Subutai and Batu Khan, a grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, watered their horses in the Danube River, their scouts peering into the fields of Austria. All of Christendom held its breath, praying and preparing for an end that felt utterly inevitable. And then, nothing. Thousands of miles away in Mongolia, the Great Khan Ögedei had died. The news, traveling at the speed of horse and rumor, finally reached the Mongol commanders. By sacred tradition, every prince of royal blood had to return to the capital to elect a new Great Khan. So, as mysteriously as they'd arrived, the Mongol armies turned their horses around and vanished back into the east. Europe was saved by a fluke, a stroke of pure luck. But what if that luck had run out? What if Ögedei Khan hadn't died? What if the order to retreat never came? Today we're exploring the shocking timeline where the Mongols didn't turn back, unleashing their full fury on the knights and castles of Europe, and violently redrawing the map of the world forever. To grasp the catastrophe that was avoided, we first have to understand our point of divergence. In our alternate timeline, in December of 1241, Ögedei Khan, third son and successor to Genghis, doesn't die. Maybe his advisors convince him to skip that last drink, or maybe he just gets a good night's sleep. The outcome is the same. He lives. And because he lives, the Mongol invasion of Europe remains on track. Batu Khan, who in our history had to pull back to get involved in the succession, now has no reason to stop. The green light from Ögedei to conquer Europe, all the way to the Great Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, is still on. The Europe that lay before them was a bickering, fractured continent of feudal states. For centuries, its kings and princes had been tangled up in petty squabbles, totally unable to unite against a common enemy. Their armies, built around the slow, powerful armored knight, were fearsome in their own right. But they were about to clash with a way of war so alien, so brutally efficient, it would make their military traditions instantly obsolete. Pope Gregory IX had called for a crusade against the invaders, but the response was sluggish and disorganized. They thought they were facing just another barbarian raid, not the most sophisticated and disciplined military machine on the planet. With Ögedei Khan alive and the Mongol leadership united, the brilliant General Subutai sets his eyes on the heart of Christendom. The year is 1242, and the full storm is about to break. The first battles on the open plains of Germany and Italy would be a brutal shock for Europe's knights. The European way of war was all about the glorious, decisive charge of heavy cavalry, a thunderous wall of steel meant to smash enemy lines. But against the Mongols, that tactic wasn't just a mistake. It was a death sentence. The Mongol army was like a force of nature, moving as one fluid entity. It was built for speed, iron discipline, and terrifying deception. Every Mongol warrior traveled with several horses, letting them cover up to 100 miles a day, a speed that feudal armies couldn't even comprehend. Their tactics were a symphony of destruction. First came the horse archers, whose powerful composite bows could rain arrows on an enemy from 350 meters away, far outranging European crossbows. They wouldn't aim for a single killing blow, but would unleash a relentless storm of arrows to harass, demoralize, and bleed the enemy dry. European knights, trained for honorable face-to-face combat, would find themselves stuck as helpless targets. Frustrated and taunted, they would do exactly what their training told them to do: charge. And that's just what the Mongols wanted. The horse archers would suddenly part, faking a chaotic retreat, a move the Europeans would mistake for cowardice. They'd lure the heavily armored, and now exhausted, knights deep into a pre-planned killing field. Then the trap would spring. Hidden reserves of Mongol heavy lancers, armored just as heavily as their European counterparts, would slam into the knights' flanks, while the horse archers wheeled around to fire into their rear. This was the dreaded Esettenerja, or encirclement, a tactic that had destroyed armies from China to Russia. At the Battle of Liegnitz, a smaller Mongol force had used these exact tactics to annihilate a larger European army of Poles and Germans. Now just imagine that happening again and again across the Holy Roman Empire. The proud dukes of Austria, Bavaria, and Saxony charging headfirst into the same deadly traps. European knights' focus on individual glory was a fatal flaw against the selfless, coordinated units of the Mongols. On an open field, the result would be horrifyingly predictable: total Mongol victory. With the European field armies shattered, the Mongols would turn their attention to the great symbols of power, the cities and castles. A European commander, safe behind his stone walls, might have felt a flicker of hope. After all, what could these horse nomads possibly know about siege warfare? That assumption would be their last mistake. The Mongol Empire was a machine that absorbed the knowledge and technology of every culture it conquered. From their campaigns in China and Persia, they had mastered the most advanced siege engineering in the world. Their armies traveled with corps of Chinese and Persian engineers, masters of building and deploying devastating siege weapons. Suddenly, the skies above Europe's cities would darken with massive stones launched from counterweight trebuchets, a technology far more powerful than the catapults common in Europe. They hurled not just rocks, but also flaming projectiles and clay pots of burning pitch that would set entire cities ablaze. The Mongols' approach to a siege was as much psychological as it was physical. They used captured prisoners from the countryside as human shields, forcing them to fill moats and push siege towers in a practice known as takeover. They engaged in pure terror, launching severed heads over the walls to shatter the defenders' will to fight. Chroniclers claimed that after the Battle of Liegnitz, Mongols counted the dead by cutting off an ear from each victim. Faced with this brutality and a ruthlessly efficient blockade, every city would face two choices: surrender immediately and be spared to pay tribute, or resist and be utterly erased, its people massacred. Following their historic path, Vienna would likely fall by the end of 1242. By 1243, Mongol columns would be driving into the heart of Germany, leaving a trail of burning cities: Prague, Nuremberg, Cologne. By 1244 or 1245, the unstoppable horde could be at the walls of Paris. The fractured kingdoms of Europe, unable to mount a united defense, would fall one by one. A Mongol conquest of Europe wouldn't just mean destruction. It would mean a total and violent political reset. The old feudal map, a messy patchwork of kingdoms and duchies, would be wiped clean. In its place, Batu Khan would likely set up a new massive territory of the Mongol Empire, a western horde maybe, with its capital on the grassy plains of Hungary, which were perfect for their horses. Europe's ruling families, the Hohenstaufens of the Holy Roman Empire, the Capetians of France, would be given a simple choice: bow and become a puppet king, or be exterminated. Those who bent the knee, as King Bela IV of Hungary might have been forced to, would rule as vassals. Their new job? To collect tribute, gold, grain, and soldiers for future Mongol wars. Their sons would be taken as hostages to the Mongol court, a guarantee of loyalty. Feudalism, with its tangled web of personal loyalties, would be dismantled and replaced with the brutally efficient centralized Mongol bureaucracy. For the first time, Europe would be unified under a single foreign and despotic power. The constant infighting between princes would be stamped out with ruthless force. Local wars would just stop, because all military power would now belong to the Mongol overlords. The Pope, stripped of his power to rally kings and armies, would likely become a fugitive. His authority over a Mongol-dominated Christendom completely shattered. Power would shift dramatically. Cities that resisted, like Kiev, would be left as ruins. Those that surrendered or were newly built, like Vienna, would become major administrative hubs. The Orthodox Christian lands of the Rus, already under the Mongol yoke, would be pulled even deeper into the Eurasian world, cementing the split with a Catholic Europe that was now also under Mongol rule. There would be no unified Germany or Italy. Instead, the map would just show vast provinces of the Great Khan. Life in a Mongol-conquered Europe would be a strange and jarring mix of terror, stability, and bizarre cultural fusion. For the average person, the initial conquest would be an apocalypse. The Mongols were notoriously brutal, and populations that resisted were massacred without pity. In our timeline, Hungary lost up to half of its entire population. Similar devastation would have scarred Germany, France, and Italy. But after the storm, a strange, unfamiliar peace would settle over the land, the Pax Mongolica. For the first time in centuries, the continent would be mostly free of internal wars. The Mongols didn't care about the religious squabbles of their subjects. They were famously tolerant of different faiths, as long as you paid your taxes and swore loyalty to the Khan. Shamanism might be practiced next to Christianity, but the idea of a single central church enforcing religious law would be gone. This would have been catastrophic for the papacy, which had been a major unifying force in European politics. A new social pyramid would emerge. At the very top, a tiny minority of Mongol warriors and administrators. Below them, the local elites who chose to cooperate, German bureaucrats, Hungarian nobles, and vassal kings who would manage the day-to-day work of the empire. Over time, just as they did in Persia and China, the Mongol rulers would likely start to assimilate. They might adopt local customs, maybe even convert to Christianity. Their courts would become a strange hybrid of steppe traditions and European feudal style. Can you imagine Mongol German nobles jousting in tournaments, or cathedrals being built with a blend of Gothic and Chinese architectural styles? However, Europe's intellectual growth would be drastically changed. The blossoming universities and the philosophical debates that were laying the groundwork for the Renaissance would likely be stamped out by a regime that valued military skill and obedience above all else. The rise of humanism could be stopped in its tracks, replaced by a more conservative, authoritarian culture. The 100 Years' War between England and France would never happen, because France would just be another province of the Mongol Empire. The entire story of how modern nation-states were born would be cut short, replaced by a unified, despotic, and culturally blended Eurasian superstate. Despite the sheer brutality of the conquest, a Mongol-ruled Europe would have seen an incredible acceleration of technological and cultural exchange. The Mongol Empire was more than anything, a system that connected the once isolated civilizations of China and Europe. The Silk Road, now secured from end to end, would become a superhighway for goods, ideas, and technologies. The most world-changing of these technologies would be gunpowder. Invented in China, its secrets would travel west along Mongol trade routes far earlier and faster than they did in our history. European states, both inside the Mongol domain and on its edges, would rapidly adopt and innovate this new technology. This would spark an arms race, speeding up the end of the armored knight and the stone castle by decades, if not centuries. By 1300, this alternate Europe might have seen professional armies equipped with early firearms, totally changing the face of war. Communication itself would be revolutionized. The Mongols would establish their famous Vichymyayin system, a network of postal relay stations that allowed messengers and officials to travel at incredible speed. A message that once took months to get from Paris to Constantinople could now arrive in a matter of weeks, creating a level of administrative control and commercial speed that Europe had never known. Other innovations would flood into Europe. Papermaking and printing from China would arrive earlier, possibly sparking a very different kind of information revolution. Medical knowledge from Persian and Chinese doctors would be shared in Mongol-run hospitals. Advanced cartography, new mathematical concepts and technologies like the stirrup and windmill would spread across the unified continent. In short, the Mongol conquest would have forced a kind of premature globalization, blending the technologies and cultures of East and West into a single, dynamic, and often violent melting pot. But this alternate history isn't some simple story of progress. The consequences of Mongol rule would be devastating. The Pax Mongolica was a peace bought with rivers of blood. The initial slaughter and depopulation would set Europe back for generations. Entire landscapes would be transformed as the massive herds of Mongol horses overgrazed the farmlands of France and Germany. And the very thing that made the empire so connected would also be its greatest weakness. The Black Death, which in our timeline was carried along these same trade routes, would likely arrive earlier and spread even faster through the hyper-efficient Buddy-AM network. The plague, which killed up to 60% of Europe's population, could have been even worse in this timeline. The long-term global picture would also be completely different. An occupied Europe, its eyes turned inward toward its Mongol masters, would not be looking out at the oceans. The age of discovery, driven by Atlantic powers like Portugal and Spain, seeking new trade routes to the east, would probably never happen. Why risk sailing into the unknown when the entire Eurasian landmass is one giant free trade zone? This could mean no Columbus, no circumnavigation of Africa, and a radically different history for the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The rise of the Ottoman Empire might have been stopped before it even began, as it would have faced a powerful, unified Mongol state instead of a declining Byzantine one. Ultimately, the Mongol Empire itself wouldn't have lasted forever. Historically, it broke apart from internal conflicts after about a century. A European Khanate would have likely suffered the same fate by the late 14th or early 15th century. Weakened by plague and decadence, it too would begin to crumble. But the nations that would rise from its ashes wouldn't be the ones we know today. They would be hybrid kingdoms, their cultures a mix of Latin, Germanic, and steppe traditions, their politics a blend of feudal memory and a long legacy of Mongol despotism. So, what if the Mongols had conquered Europe? The world as we know it would be gone. The continent would have been unified by force, its feudal chaos replaced by a brutal but efficient imperial peace. This Vecham Pax Mongolica would have fast-tracked the spread of technology, bringing things like gunpowder and printing into a connected global economy centuries ahead of schedule. But that progress would have come at a cost that's almost impossible to imagine. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Discovery, the core pillars of the modern Western world would likely have been erased from the timeline, replaced by something darker and more authoritarian. The Europe that eventually emerged from the ashes of the broken Khanate would be a different creature entirely, its DNA forever spliced with that of the steppe nomads. The death of one man, Ögedei Khan, in the mountains of Mongolia, truly did change the course of history. His survival would have shattered a civilization, but in doing so, it might have forged a completely new and profoundly different modern world. What do you think would be the biggest long-term change if the Mongols had succeeded? Would a unified Europe under the Khan have ultimately been better or worse for humanity? Let us know your theories in the comments below.